So I got back from my trip a little earlier than planned, and when I walked in the door, I overheard my stepson's wife talking. "We'll kick things off tomorrow morning," she was saying. "The symptoms should start showing up in about a week." The very next day I gave them a performance they'd never forget. And if you're watching this right now, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know where you're from. What those two didn't realize was that this old actress still remembered all her lines and I was about to win an Oscar. But before we get into that, let me rewind a little because when you're talking about family betrayal, context is everything. When my husband Arthur and I got married 30 years ago, we each brought a child into the family. I had my son Michael, who was 7, and Arthur had his son Mark, who was 3. Mark's mom had left them a while back to go on some kind of European adventure, complete with pharmaceutical experiments. Arthur and I built sterling construction from the ground up while raising both boys as if they were our own. Then 10 years ago Arthur passed away and I became the sole owner of a company now valued at $50 million. I was actually planning on selling it the following week and dividing the money 3 ways so Michael, Mark, and I would each get an equal share. Apparently Mark had a different idea about what fair really meant. The flight back from Toronto was supposed to land Sunday night, but it was just so cold there. The kind of freezing cold that just goes right through you and aches in your bones. My older son Michael had a beautiful wedding. Watching him marry Victoria in that small chapel overlooking Lake Ontario actually gave me hope that some people really do get their happily ever after. Unlike some of us who spend decades raising someone else's ungrateful kids. But after just 2 days of that brutal Canadian winter, I'd had more than enough of feeling like a human popsicle. So I caught a red-eye flight on Friday night instead, completely exhausted but thrilled to be heading back to some civilized temperatures. The taxi dropped me off a little after 11 p.m., and I noticed the kitchen lights were still on. That struck me as odd. Mark usually spent his Friday nights out at the bars, burning through cash like a teenager with a brand new credit card. I let myself in as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake them up. I mean, they were doing me such a huge favor by house-sitting, right? How unbelievably thoughtful of my younger stepson to finally take an interest in my home. Though at that point I was starting to suspect his interest wasn't strictly about the architecture. The conversation drifting from the kitchen made me freeze right there in the hallway. And let me tell you, after 27 years of raising someone else's child, I was sure I had heard everything they could possibly say. I was dead wrong. "We'll start tomorrow morning," I heard Jessica say as casually as if she were talking about the weather. "The symptoms should start showing up in about a week or so." My blood instantly turned to ice water. But honestly, and I'm not proud of this, part of me was almost impressed by the sheer, shameless audacity of it all. Almost. "And then what?" Mark's voice sounded tight with a kind of nervousness that suggested he was no stranger to making monumentally stupid decisions. "She's already forgetful. Has to be documented. Otherwise we can't get full guardianship." Guardianship? Well, that cleared things right up. That's why Mark had suddenly taken such a keen interest in my well-being. Nothing says loving family like a good old-fashioned systematic poisoning. "What about Michael?" I heard Mark ask. "When he finds out." "Michael's in Canada right now," Jessica cut him off. "By the time he figures out what's going on, it will be way too late. The company will be under our control and we can just sell the whole thing ourselves. All of it. Not just 1/3. And there was. After 27 years of raising this boy, his grand master plan was to drug me into submission so he could steal the entire company instead of just accepting his fair share. I'd always known Mark wasn't the brightest bulb in the box, but this plan was impressively dumb even for him. I crept closer, trying to catch more of their brilliant criminal discussion. "What if she fights us?" Mark whispered. "She won't," Jessica replied with utter confidence. "Trust me, by the end of the week she'll be much more manageable." Manageable. As if I were a difficult pet that they just needed to tranquilize. "But Michael gets 1/3 too," Mark insisted. "He'll know something's wrong when—" "Michael will get absolutely nothing if there's nothing left to inherit," she interrupted. "We'll sell the company, keep all the money, and by the time anyone figures it out we'll be long gone." Well, if they wanted a confused old woman, I was going to give them the performance of their lives. After all, I'd been dealing with Mark's dramatics for almost 3 decades. I knew exactly how to play to this particular audience. So I opened the front door again and slammed it shut with a loud bang. "Hello, anyone home?" I called out. I could hear rapid whispers from the kitchen, followed by hurried footsteps. Showtime. Eleanor. You're back early. Jessica appeared, her face plastered with a big smile and a look of fake concern. The woman could have easily won an Oscar for Most Convincing Future Felon. We weren't expecting you back until Sunday. Yeah, I came back early, I said a little curtly. Too cold. I rolled my suitcase across the floor, watching Mark hang back in the kitchen doorway like a guilty teenager caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Hope you two didn't get into too much trouble without adult supervision. Of course not. Jessica laughed. I heard that signature tinkling sound she made when she was lying, which was about 90% of the time. We've just been taking care of everything. How was the wedding? I asked, my voice as casual as can be. Beautiful. Michael looked so happy. I stared directly at Mark, who was doing his best impression of a deer caught in headlights. He looks genuinely, truly happy. It's really something to see what happens when a person finds someone who actually loves them for who they are. Mark shifted uncomfortably and I let him. He deserved to squirm a little. That's great, Mom, he mumbled. I'm glad Michael's doing well. He only ever called me Mom when he wanted something. Usually it was just Eleanor, and on his particularly bad days, it was, that woman Dad married. Yes, well, I smiled pleasantly. He's always been the responsible one. Speaking of which, I'm absolutely exhausted. I think I'll just head straight to bed. Wait. Jessica called out, appearing with a glass of what looked like perfectly innocent warm milk, complete with a sprinkle of cinnamon on top. How domestic. How thoughtful. And how absolutely, positively dripping with pharmaceutical enhancements. I was completely certain now. I made you some warm milk, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Thought it might help you sleep after all that traveling. I took the glass with both hands, making sure they could see how steady my grip was. For now. How thoughtful of you, dear, I said. Then I did something that probably saved my life. I lifted the glass to my lips but didn't actually drink. I just let a tiny bit of the liquid touch my mouth and immediately tasted something that was definitely not cinnamon. It was bitter and chemical, and it made my lips tingle and feel slightly numb. Holy hell. Whatever they were using wasn't just some gentle sleep aid. This was some kind of industrial-strength, stupidity juice. You know what? I said, lowering the glass. I think I'm actually too wired to sleep just yet. Maybe I'll save this for later. I set the glass on the hallway table and headed upstairs, feeling the weight of their disappointed stares boring into my back. 27 years of raising someone else's child, and this was the thanks I got. Well, if Mark and his little wife thought they could outscheme a woman who had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing, they were about to get a painful lesson in just how wrong two people could be. The poor lambs had no clue they had just declared war on a person who had been winning battles since before they were born. Saturday morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a strange grogginess. I shuffled downstairs, desperate for my usual morning coffee to help clear the fog in my brain. I went through my normal routine, grinding the beans, measuring the water, the same familiar ritual I'd been doing for the past 40 years. The coffee smelled amazing as it always did. Rich, dark, and full of promise. I took my first sip and immediately knew something was wrong. It wasn't the taste, which seemed normal, but within minutes the edges of the room started to feel a little fuzzy. That wasn't just post-travel fatigue. It was the coffee. They had gotten to my coffee. By the time Mark appeared in the kitchen, I was genuinely struggling to think clearly. The effect from the milk was mild, but this was different. This was a full-on pharmaceutical fog rolling through my brain. Morning, sweetheart, I said, noting that he looked like he'd slept about as well as someone plotting to poison his stepmother should. Which is to say, not at all. Fine, thanks. How about you? You look a little tired. Tired, I repeated to myself. Right. That's what you call someone who has been unknowingly drugged with their morning coffee. I feel strange, I admitted, because it was true. Dizzy, like my head's full of cotton. Maybe it's just jet lag, he suggested, but I saw the flicker of satisfaction on his face. I knew I needed to stop drinking the coffee, but if I suddenly changed a 40-year routine they would know I was onto them. So I took another small sip, just enough to make it look normal. While my brain fought through the increasing fog, Jessica appeared in her silk robe, looking like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. The woman had many talents, lying, scheming, and pharmaceutical mixology, but a bad hair day was never one of her problems. Good morning, Eleanor. You look so refreshed. Refreshed? I thought. I looked exactly like someone who had been drugged because I had been. Thank you, dear. It's amazing what a good night's sleep can do, I said, though I felt more like I'd been hit by a truck driven by a very polite pharmacist. By mid-morning, according to their timeline, I was supposed to be getting sluggish and confused. The problem was, I actually was getting sluggish and confused, which meant I needed to start my own performance while also fighting off the very real effects of the drugs. You know, I said, standing up and deliberately swaying, though to be honest some of that swaying was completely real. I feel a bit lightheaded. Mark was at my side immediately, like a vulture circling its wounded prey. Careful, Mom. Here, let me help you to the living room. As he guided me to the couch, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked exactly like what they needed me to look like. A woman slowly losing her grip on reality. The only problem was this time it wasn't entirely an act. This is so embarrassing, I said, settling onto the cushions. I've never felt so scattered. It's perfectly normal, Jessica assured me with all the warmth of a funeral director. Travel can be exhausting. Why don't you just rest here? We'll take care of everything. We'll take care of everything, I thought. Including making sure I consume enough drugs to sign away my life's work. But here's the thing about underestimating someone. It only works if the person you're underestimating lets it work. And even with a pharmaceutical fog clouding my judgment, I was still sharp enough to know I was in a fight for my life. Sunday morning brought a delightful new development. They were getting bolder, which in their case meant they were getting even stupider. And that was really saying something given where they started. I came downstairs moving carefully. This was partly because they expected me to be impaired and partly because I was still feeling the lingering effects of yesterday's coffee adventure. I had managed to avoid drinking much of it, but even small amounts of whatever they were using packed a serious punch. Mark was waiting with what looked like a healthy smoothie. It was thick purple and smelled like berries with a subtle undertone of industrial-grade brain fog. "Morning, Mom," he said cheerfully. "I thought you might like something healthy today. You didn't eat much yesterday." Of course I didn't, I thought. I was too busy trying to avoid your poison buffet, you genius. That's sweet of you to offer, but I'm really not hungry right now. You, on the other hand, should definitely eat to keep your strength up. Come on, just a few sips. The way he was pushing that drink made my internal alarm bells go off. This wasn't their usual subtle, manipulative game. This was pure desperation, all mixed up and served in a glass. Maybe a little later. I think I need to just sit down for a minute. I managed to make my way over to the living room couch, making sure to look a little unsteady on my feet. Mark followed me, still holding that so-called smoothie like a waiter at some terrible restaurant. "Mom, I'm really worried about you. You're getting worse," he insisted. "Getting worse, huh? Worse according to what standard? Is there a metric for how well you've succeeded at drugging your stepmother? Because if so, their little coffee trick had worked better than they probably even realized." "I think I should see a doctor," I said, mostly because I was curious to see what they'd say. "Actually, we've already taken care of that," he replied. "Dr. Evans is coming by this afternoon to check on you." Dr. Evans? I instantly recognized the name. Arthur had brought him up years ago. Some shady doctor who'd lost his license for faking medical records, then got it back on a technicality. The fact that they were bringing him in meant this was way more serious than I had first thought. "I'd really rather see Dr. Nelson," I countered. "He's been my doctor for over 20 years. Jessica jumped in saying, "Dr. Nelson is all booked up for weeks. Dr. Evans specializes in geriatric issues." Geriatric issues, or as I like to call it, how to declare an old person incompetent for fun and profit. I spent the rest of the morning playing the part of a woman whose mind was slowly turning to mush, all while fighting off the very real side effects of whatever they'd put in my coffee. I called Jessica by my neighbor's name 3 times. I asked Mark to help me figure out how to work the TV remote. I even put salt in my orange juice instead of sugar and then looked completely confused as to why it tasted so bad. The entire time, though, my mind was sharp and I was taking careful mental notes of everything they said and did. The best part? They were totally falling for my act. Watching them give each other those little satisfied looks was like seeing 2 people high-five because they managed to trick a toddler into eating a carrot. It was almost kind of sweet. Around noon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the window, I saw a skinny man in a wrinkled suit carrying what was supposed to be a medical bag, but it had all the importance of a briefcase full of forged documents. Dr. Evans, I figured. Arthur's old pal who had fallen from grace and was now apparently moonlighting for shady at-home medical assessments. "Mom, the doctor's here," Mark announced as if this was wonderful news and not the next step in their plan to fleece their stepmother. What followed was probably the most half-baked medical evaluation in the history of healthcare fraud. Dr. Evans asked me basic questions. What year it was, who the president was, could I count backward from 100? Mark and Jessica hovered over us like proud stage parents at the world's worst talent show. I answered every question correctly, but I made sure to do it slowly, with just enough hesitation to imply confusion without looking completely out of it. It was a very delicate balancing act. If I seemed too sharp, they'd just increase the dosage. If I acted too far gone, they might panic and move to something more drastic. "Mrs. Sterling, I just need you to sign a few papers," he said, handing me a pen and a stack of documents. "They're just routine medical forms." Even through my fog of feigned confusion, I could clearly see that these were not medical forms. Words like conservatorship and power of attorney jumped out at me like flashing neon signs. "I can't really read these," I said, which was becoming less of a lie thanks to their little chemistry experiment. "That's perfectly normal," he reassured me. "Just sign at the bottom of each page. Basically, just sign away your independence, old lady. No big deal." "I don't think I should sign anything right now," I said. "I can't think straight." "Mom," Mark insisted, "Dr. Evans says these forms will help you get the care you need." The care I needed, right? The kind of care that involved signing over my entire life's work to someone who thought drugging an elderly person was a good business model. "But I still can't read them." "That's why we're here to help you," Jessica chimed in with all the sincerity of a used car salesman. I took a look around the room, at Mark and Jessica circling like vultures, at Dr. Evans sweating in his cheap suit, at the stack of papers that would turn me into a prisoner in my own home. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I let a little real fear show. Because even though I knew it was mostly an act and even though I was aware of what they were trying to do, the situation was genuinely terrifying. "I'm scared," I said, and that part wasn't an act at all. "Don't worry," Mark said, patting my hand like I was a lost child. "We'll take care of everything." And that was exactly what I was afraid of. Monday morning was the first real test of my acting skills, and after 3 straight days of pretending to lose my mind while fighting off the actual side effects of whatever they'd given me, I was starting to see why actors get paid so much. I came downstairs carrying a manila folder, looking completely and appropriately bewildered. It was easy to look tired and confused because I genuinely was. I'd been up for half the night planning my next move while pretending to sleep like a drugged patient. I'd also made a crucial decision: no more coffee. Whatever they were putting in the grounds was just too strong and I needed my wits about me. I'd have to find a way to fake my morning routine. "Mark, honey, I found these papers in my study, but I just can't remember what they're for." I held out the folder to him and watched his face as he took it. Inside were the original incorporation documents for Sterling Construction, the company Arthur and I had built from the ground up over 40 years. His eyes lit up like it was Christmas morning, which would have been sweet if he wasn't planning on stealing it all. "Oh, these are just some old business papers, Mom. Nothing important," he said dismissively. "Nothing important, huh? Just the legal foundation for a $50 million company. But who's counting, right? Are you sure?" I asked, feigning confusion. I thought they might be something I needed to sign. No, he quickly reassured me. "You don't need to worry about business stuff anymore." And there it was. Their assumption that I was too far gone to understand my own company, the same one I'd been running successfully by myself for the last decade since Arthur passed away. But wait, isn't the company mine now? Since Arthur died. The look that passed between Mark and Jessica was absolutely priceless. It was like 2 people who thought they were sneaking cookies and suddenly realized the person they believed was blind had just caught them. "Technically, yes," Mark admitted. "But Mom, you're not really in any condition to run a construction company." "Technically," I repeated, as if there were any other way to interpret the fact that I had been operating the business for a decade. "I'm not," I asked, looking genuinely bewildered. No. It's really complicated," he said. "There are so many regulations, financial decisions, and employee management issues," he went on, explaining how complicated the business was. This from a man whose most difficult business decision was probably whether to order a beer or a glass of wine with his dinner. "So what should I do with it then?" I asked innocently. Well, Jessica jumped in with all the subtlety of a freight train, there are people who specialize in managing companies for families who can't do it themselves. Like who? I asked. Like us, Mark said, apparently having forgotten that his only business experience was spending other people's money and complaining about having to work for it. I blinked at him, putting on a show of total confusion. But don't you need experience for that? And some kind of training? The silence that followed was beautiful. You could practically hear his brain struggling to come up with a believable answer. I've been watching and learning for years, Mom, he finally said. And Jessica has a business degree. A business degree? Right, and I had wings and a unicorn horn. But I nodded thoughtfully as if his explanation made perfect sense. That sounds very generous, I said. But what about Michael? Doesn't he have a say in family business decisions? Michael lives in Canada now, Mark said firmly, trying to shut down the topic. He has his own career. He's not interested in construction. And that part was actually true. Michael was a successful architect and had never shown any interest in the family business. But I had a feeling he'd be very interested in preventing his younger brother from stealing it. I suppose that makes sense, I said. I looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. I'm still confused about something, though. What's that? Mark asked cautiously. If I'm not competent to run my own company, how can I be competent enough to sign papers giving it to you? The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming. Mark looked like I just asked him to explain quantum physics through interpretive dance. Jessica's smile became so strained, I was afraid her face might crack. Well, she finally said, that's what lawyers are for, to make sure everything is done properly. Lawyers, right? The same lawyers who'd be willing to notarize documents for someone who couldn't even remember their own address. Lawyers? Are we getting lawyers involved? I asked, feigning surprise. Just to make sure everything is legal and above board, Mark assured me, sounding about as sincere as a politician promising lower taxes. That afternoon, while they thought I was taking a nap, honestly, how much napping did they think one person could do? I made the first of several phone calls that would change everything. Robert, it's Eleanor Sterling. I need to see you urgently. Of course, Eleanor. What can I do for you? I need you to officially document that I am mentally competent and aware of my decisions. And Robert, if anything happens to me in the next few weeks, I want you to know that it was not an accident. There was a long pause. Eleanor, what's going on? I'll explain everything when I see you, I said. But Robert, if anyone tries to tell you I'm incompetent or confused, don't believe them. And whatever you do, don't let anyone else make decisions for me without my explicit, recorded consent. The second call was much harder to make. Michael, it's Mom. Mom, hi. How are you feeling? You sounded a little off when we talked yesterday. Yesterday's call. I could barely remember it through the pharmaceutical fog they'd put me in. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen very carefully. Okay, you're scaring me, Mom. Mark and Jessica are trying to drug me. They want to have me declared incompetent so they can steal the company. Silence. A long, uncomfortable silence. Mom, that sounds... Are you sure you're feeling all right? Michael, I know how this sounds, but they've been putting something in my coffee. I heard them planning it Friday night. Maybe you just misheard something, he said. Mark wouldn't do that. Michael, please. I'm not confused. I'm not paranoid. I'm telling you your brother is systematically poisoning me and I need help. Another pause. Mom, when was the last time you saw a doctor? He didn't believe me. My own son thought I was losing my mind. Never mind, I said quickly. I'm probably just tired. Forget I called. Mom, wait. I just hung up the phone. Since Michael wasn't going to help me, I realized I was on my own. It was a strange feeling sitting there in my study looking out at the garden Arthur and I had planted together ages ago. 20 years to be exact. Arthur had always had a bad feeling about Mark. I can still hear his voice in my head warning me, mark my words, Eleanor. That boy has no backbone and is way too entitled. It's a dangerous combination. I had always tried to defend Mark, making excuses for his failures and holding on to the hope that my love and patience would eventually help him grow into a decent person. Turns out Arthur was right all along. But unlike Arthur, I wasn't about to let Mark get away with this. Tuesday was when things really started to get serious. It was an escalation I should have seen coming, yet it still caught me off guard. When I woke up I felt weird. Not confused or groggy, since I'd successfully avoided their drugged coffee the day before, but something was definitely off. It took me a few minutes to connect the dots. They had been trying to get more aggressive with their other attempts. The smoothie Mark kept pushing, the tea Jessica offered, even the glass of water she'd left by my bed. I was willing to bet they'd all been enhanced with their special little ingredients. Real brilliant move, you idiots. Nothing says subtle criminal genius like upping your poisoning attempts the minute your victim starts asking inconvenient questions. I went downstairs to find Mark waiting for me with a thick purple smoothie. It smelled like berries, but with a subtle industrial-strength hint of cognitive impairment. "Morning, Mom," he chirped. "I thought you might like something healthy today." Healthy, I thought to myself. Right. If healthy meant enough sedatives to knock out a small horse. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, "but I'm not really hungry right now." He insisted, "You need to keep your strength up. Just a few sips." The desperation in his voice was almost comical, like watching someone try to convince a friend on a diet to eat a huge piece of cake by insisting it's just a salad. "Maybe later," I replied. "I think I need to sit down." I made my way to the living room, making sure my movements looked appropriately unsteady. Since I'd been avoiding their special breakfast buffet, it was easier to control the performance now. "Mom, I'm really worried about you," Mark said, his voice dripping with false concern. "You're getting worse." Getting worse, I thought. According to whose timeline? The one where I was supposed to be a drooling invalid by now, ready to sign away my life's work without even looking at the fine print? "I think I should see a doctor," I said. "Actually, Dr. Evans called," Mark replied. "He wants to come back today to finish your evaluation." Finish my evaluation was just code for get those signatures while she's still coherent enough to hold a pen. I sighed. "I don't know if I'm up for more doctor visits." "It's important, Mom," he said. "For your health." For my health, I thought. Right. Because nothing promotes wellness like having your legal rights systematically stripped away by people who think elder abuse is a viable retirement plan. 2 hours later, Dr. Evans showed up, his briefcase bulging with forged documents and his nervous energy cranked up to 11. This time there was no pretense of a medical evaluation. This was strictly business. "Mrs. Sterling," he began, "based on my assessment, I'm recommending immediate intervention. You're showing signs of severe cognitive decline." "I don't understand," I said, playing dumb. "It means you need someone to take care of you," he explained, spreading a stack of papers on the coffee table like a casino dealer. "These papers will ensure you get the help you need." Even through my feigned confusion, I could see what they were. A power of attorney, a conservatorship petition, and something that looked suspiciously like a commitment order. They weren't just planning to steal my money, they were planning to have me locked up. "I can't read these," I said, which was only a slight lie now that my head was clearer. "That's exactly why you need to sign them," Mark chimed in. "So people who can read them can take care of you." The logic was so ridiculously circular it almost took my breath away. I'm too confused to read legal documents, therefore I should sign legal documents that give other people complete control over my life. It was like arguing that someone was too drunk to drive, so they should definitely sign over their car keys. "What happens after I sign these?" I asked. "You'll be transferred to a facility where you can get proper care," Dr. Evans said. "A facility?" I repeated. How delightfully vague. I was picturing a place with locked doors and windows that didn't open. "What kind of facility?" "A place that specializes in people with your condition," he replied. "Very nice. Very comfortable. How long would I stay there?" "That depends on your progress. Possibly permanently." Permanently. Well, at least they were being honest about their long-term plans. I looked around the room. Mark was trying to look concerned while practically salivating over my signature. Jessica was hovering like a well-dressed vulture. And Dr. Evans was sweating through his cheap suit, ready to rubber stamp my mental incompetence. In that moment, I made a decision that probably saved my life. "Hey," I said. "I'll sign them." But just as Dr. Evans reached for his pen, my phone rang. "Oh, that's probably Michael calling back," I said. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, a wave of pure, unfiltered panic flashed across their faces. The look of relief when I ignored the ringing phone was absolutely spectacular. It was like watching three people realize they just won the lottery, except their prize was my entire life and I was the one holding the winning ticket. What they didn't know was that I had been expecting that call. "This is for the best, Mom," Mark said as Dr. Evans efficiently prepared the papers, like he'd done this many times before. "Safer from what?" I asked myself. "From people who might try to take advantage of you? From making decisions that could hurt you financially?" The irony was so thick you could serve it for dinner. "What kind of decisions?" I asked. "Well, like deciding to give away the company to charity," Mark replied, "or changing your will without understanding what you're doing." This was interesting. So they knew about my charitable inclinations. I had never actually mentioned giving the company away, which meant they must have been monitoring my communications more closely than I thought. "But I haven't decided to give anything to charity," I said. "You mentioned it last month," Mark countered. "Said you were thinking about leaving everything to some foundation for underprivileged children." I had absolutely no memory of saying that, which meant either my memory was worse than I thought or they were just making things up to justify their actions. I was betting on the latter. "Why would that be a problem?" I asked. "Because it would leave us, your family, with nothing," Jessica interjected, sounding incredibly righteous for someone who had never done a day's work to build the company she was trying to steal. "But it's my company, isn't it?" I asked. "Technically yes, but morally it belongs to family." Morally, I thought. The audacity of someone systematically poisoning an elderly relative for inheritance money was truly something else. Dr. Evans cleared his throat, trying to get his cast of characters back on script. "Perhaps we should focus on the documents," he said, handing me a pen and pointing to the first signature line. "Just sign here, Mrs. Sterling." I took the pen, my hands trembling slightly, partly as a performance and partly out of genuine nervousness. I paused. "What happens after I sign these?" I asked. "You'll be safe," Mark said, his voice full of phony reassurance. "Protected, cared for. Protected like a butterfly in a jar," I thought to myself. Beautiful, contained, and slowly suffocating. I was about to sign the first document not because I planned to honor it but because I needed them to think they had won. That's when the front door burst open. "Don't sign anything," Michael yelled from the doorway. He looked like he'd traveled through several time zones and multiple states of panic to get here. Right behind him were two uniformed police officers. "Michael," I said, letting real surprise and relief flood my voice. "What are you doing here?" "I got your message," he said, breathing hard. "The one you left on my voicemail last night." "What message?" I hadn't left any message. Then I remembered. Yesterday, when they thought I was napping, I had called Michael back and gotten his voicemail. In my drugged-up haze, I had apparently rambled about Mark, Jessica, and danger, and I had made more sense than I had thought. "I caught the red eye," Michael continued, his eyes darting around the room, taking everything in. "Called the police from the airport when I heard what you said about being drugged." The next few seconds were pure theater. Dr. Evans suddenly remembered he had another appointment. Mark started babbling about misunderstandings and family disagreements with the coherence of someone speaking in tongues. And Jessica, she disappeared into the kitchen and reappeared with a suitcase, apparently planning to make a run for it like this was some kind of bad heist movie. As for me, I sat on the couch, still holding the pen, and watched 27 years of resentment and entitlement finally catch up with my stepson. "Ma'am, are you Eleanor Sterling?" the first officer asked. "Yes," I replied. "Your son called us from Toronto," he continued. "Said you were being held against your will and possibly drugged. Is that accurate?" I looked around the room, at Michael's worried face, at Mark's panicked expression, at Jessica clutching her suitcase like a security blanket, and at Dr. Evans, who was sweating through his suit like he was in a sauna. It was showtime. "Officer, for the past week, these people have been drugging my food and drinks to make me appear mentally incompetent so they could steal my company," I said. "That's not true," Mark protested with all the conviction of a person caught red-handed. "She's confused. She's been having episodes." "What kind of episodes?" the officer asked, pulling out his notepad as if this was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. "Memory loss, disorientation, difficulty with basic tasks," Mark listed. "And when did these episodes start?" the officer asked. "About a week ago," Mark answered. "Right around the time I came home early and overheard their master plan." "What a coincidence." The officer made a note. "Mrs. Sterling, Do you have any evidence of these alleged drugging incidents? I reached into my bathrobe pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder I'd been carrying for the last 3 days. I've been recording conversations since Sunday, I said. Would you like to hear them? The looks on their faces were worth every moment of the past week's performance. Game, set, and match. What followed was the most entertaining hour I'd had in years. As the police listened to my recordings, Mark and Jessica's story fell apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. We heard Mark discussing the need to get control before Michael finds out. We heard Jessica talking about making me more cooperative and the timeline pressures. We heard Dr. Evans coaching them on what symptoms to document and how to make the evaluation look legitimate. We even heard Mark say, if she won't sign willingly, we'll have to find another way. But the recording that really sealed their fate was from Tuesday morning, when they didn't know I was listening from the top of the stairs. She's getting suspicious. Jessica's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. What if she refuses to sign? She asked. Then we move to Plan B, Mark stated in response. And what is that? She inquired. Accidents happen to confused elderly people all the time, he explained, especially to those who might wander around at night, perhaps take too many pills, or maybe even fall down the stairs. A profound silence descended upon the room. The quiet was so intense that even the police officers present appeared stunned. When the final recordings came to an end, Mark and Jessica were in handcuffs. Dr. Evans was being questioned regarding his medical license, and I was being taken to an actual hospital for blood tests. It appeared that even though I had managed to mostly avoid their attempts to drug me, the coffee incident had left enough evidence in my system to be detected. Mrs. Sterling, the emergency room physician said, his gaze fixed on my lab results. He had the kind of expression one gets when they discover something truly unsettling under a microscope. We have found detectable levels of benzodiazepines in your bloodstream. While not high enough to be immediately dangerous, the amount is significant enough to have caused the symptoms you described. How long will it take for my system to be clear? I asked. A few days with plenty of rest and proper hydration, he replied. However, Mrs. Sterling, the emotional toll of this kind of betrayal can take much longer to heal. I reflected on his words as Michael sat by my hospital bed, holding my hand as if he feared I might vanish if he let go. I am so sorry, Mom, he said. I should have believed you the moment you called. You came when I needed you, I told him. That is what truly matters. But what if I hadn't listened to that voicemail, if I hadn't gotten on that plane? He worried aloud. But you did, I pointed out, and now it is over. Except it was not entirely finished. The matter of justice still needed to be addressed. Michael, I need you to do something for me, I said. Anything, he responded. I need you to make sure they are held accountable for this. Not just legally but completely, I instructed. I want everyone to know what they attempted to do. Mom, are you sure about this? He asked. The trial will be public. People will know what happened. People will know that I survived a plot to steal my life and my livelihood, I said, and that I was smart enough to expose the people who tried to do it. I gave his hand a squeeze. I am not the victim in this story, Michael. I am the woman who outsmarted 2 criminals who believed they could drug an elderly person into submission. What about the company? He asked. The company is yours now. All of it. Assuming you want it, I said. What? He stammered. Mark was right about one thing, I continued. I had planned to split the company 3 ways. But after this past week I have realized something important. Some things should remain in the family. The right family. Michael was silent for a long moment. I do not know anything about running a construction company, he finally said. You will learn, I assured him. You are smart, honest, and you possess something Mark never had. What is that? He asked. Integrity, I replied. Also, you have never tried to poison me for money, which really gives you a significant advantage when it comes to qualifications. We both laughed, and for the first time in what felt like a week, the world felt right again. But I was not finished with Mark and Jessica yet. Not by a long shot. The next 60 minutes were more entertaining than any I had experienced in years. As the police listened to the recordings I had made, Mark and Jessica's story collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. We heard Mark discussing gaining control before Michael found out. We heard Jessica talking about how to make me more cooperative and the time pressures they were under. We heard Dr. Evans coaching them on which symptoms to document and how to make the evaluation seem legitimate. We heard Mark say, "If she will not sign willingly, we will have to find another way." But the recording that truly sealed their fate was from a morning earlier in the week when they were unaware I was listening from the top of the stairs. "She is getting suspicious," Jessica's voice came through as clear as a bell. "What if she refuses to sign?" "Then we move to Plan B," Mark replied. "And what is that?" she asked. "Accidents happen to confused elderly people all the time," he explained, "especially to those who might wander around at night, maybe take too many pills, or perhaps even fall down the stairs." The hush that followed was deafening. Even the police officers looked completely shocked. By the time the recordings were over, Mark and Jessica were in handcuffs. Dr. Evans was being questioned about his medical license, and I was being taken to an actual hospital for blood tests because, apparently, even though I had successfully avoided most of their pharmaceutical buffet, the coffee incident had left enough traces in my system to show up on tests. The emergency room doctor, looking at my lab results with the expression of someone who had just found something disturbing under a microscope, said, "Mrs. Sterling, you have detectable levels of benzodiazepines in your bloodstream. Not high enough to be immediately dangerous, but significant enough to cause the symptoms you described. How long will it take to clear my system?" "A few days with proper hydration and rest." "But Mrs. Sterling, the psychological impact of this kind of betrayal can take a much longer time to heal." I thought about that as Michael sat beside my hospital bed, holding my hand as if I might vanish if he let go. "I am so sorry, Mom. I should have believed you right away when you called." "You came when I needed you," I told him. "That is what matters." "But what if I had not listened to that voicemail, if I had not gotten on that flight?" he asked. "But you did, and now it is over." Except it was not entirely over yet. There was still the matter of justice to consider. "Michael, I need you to do something for me," I said. "Anything," he responded. "I need you to make sure they pay for this. Not just legally but completely. I want everyone to know what they tried to do." "Mom, are you sure?" he asked. "The trial will be public. People will know what happened. People will know that I survived an attempt to steal my life and my livelihood, and that I was clever enough to catch the people who tried to do it," I said, squeezing his hand. "I am not the victim in this story, Michael. I am the woman who outsmarted two criminals who thought they could drug an elderly person into submission," I said to him. "What about the company?" he asked. "The company is now yours. Every last bit of it. That is, if you want it," I told him. What?" he stammered. "Mark was right about one thing," I continued. "I had been planning to divide it into 3 parts. However, after the events of this past week, I have come to an important realization. Some things are meant to stay within the family. The right family." Michael fell silent for a long moment. "I don't know anything about running a construction company," he admitted. "You will learn," I assured him. "You are smart and honest, and you possess a quality Mark never had." "What is that?" he asked. "Integrity," I replied. "And you have also never tried to poison me for money, which really sets you apart in terms of qualifications." We both laughed, and for the first time in an entire week, it felt as though the world had returned to its proper alignment. But I was not finished with Mark and Jessica yet. Not by a long shot. 3 months later, I was standing in a courtroom, wearing my finest suit and my most content expression. I watched as Mark was sentenced to 15 years in prison for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted theft. Jessica received a sentence of 12 years. Dr. Evans, who turned out to be exactly as Arthur had described, a doctor who had lost his way and found it again in all the wrong places, had his license permanently revoked and was sentenced to 5 years. "Do you have anything to say to the court?" the judge asked me. I slowly rose to my feet, not because I was frail. The drugs had been completely cleared from my system weeks ago, but because I wanted to savor every second of that moment. "Your Honor," I began, "I raised Mark Sterling for 27 years. I fed him, clothed him, gave him an education, and loved him as if he were my own son. I gave him every single opportunity to grow into a decent human being." I looked directly at Mark, who was staring at his shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. Instead, he repaid that love by attempting to systematically poison me into legal incompetence so he could steal everything I had worked for. When he was caught, he showed no remorse, only anger that his plan had failed. I paused, allowing that to sink in for the packed courtroom. Yes, this case had become something of a local sensation. It seemed the story of an elderly woman outsmarting her stepson's drugging scheme was the kind of tale that truly captured people's imagination. I want the court to know that I feel no pity for him. I feel no family loyalty towards someone who was willing to destroy my mind and my freedom for money. And I hope his sentence serves as a warning to anyone else who thinks elderly people are easy targets. The judge nodded in approval. Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. Your courage in documenting this abuse has ensured that these defendants can never victimize anyone else. Courage. I preferred to think of it as being too stubborn to quietly pass away. But courage worked too. After the sentencing, Michael and I went to lunch at my favorite restaurant, the very same place where Arthur and I used to celebrate our business victories back when we were building the company from nothing. How does it feel? Michael asked me. Like justice, I replied simply. Although I must admit, there is something profoundly satisfying about watching people who thought they were so clever discover that they were not nearly as smart as they believed. What happens now? He asked. How I live, I said. I will help you transition into running the company. I will travel somewhere warm and I will never again take family loyalty for granted. And Mark? Michael wondered. I thought about my stepson who would spend the next 15 years learning what it felt like to have no control over his daily life, his food, his schedule, or his future. The irony was almost too perfect. Mark was going to experience exactly what he had tried to do to me. The only difference was that he actually deserved it. That evening, I sat in my living room, my real living room, finally free of people who wanted to hurt me, and called Victoria, Michael's wife. Eleanor, how are you doing? She asked. I am perfect, dear, I said. But I wanted to thank you again for encouraging Michael to listen to that voicemail. Of course, she responded. Family protects family. Yes, I agreed. Real family does. Outside my window, the evening was settling in, peaceful and quiet. Inside my house, I was finally completely safe. Mark had tried to steal my mind, my freedom, and my fortune. Instead, he had given me something invaluable. He had given me the knowledge that I was strong enough, smart enough, and stubborn enough to save myself. That sense of triumph was more precious than any inheritance he could have imagined. The trial, spanning a period of 2 weeks, met all my expectations. I spent a total of 3 hours on the witness stand, guiding the jury through the entire ordeal, from the moment I unexpectedly arrived home to the time of Mark's arrest. The court played the recordings and I saw Mark wince when his own voice filled the room. The full collection of recordings was played, not just a portion. When the prosecutor, Mrs. Sterling, asked if I had feared for my life, I responded unequivocally. Absolutely, I said. My stepson planned to drug me into incompetence and steal everything I had worked for. Had my son not arrived precisely when he did, I believe I would either be dead or confined in some facility. Mark's attorney attempted to present it all as a simple misunderstanding, suggesting that Mark was merely worried about my mental well-being. Looking directly at Mark, I retorted. He showed his concern by systematically poisoning me. The jury needed 4 hours to reach a verdict. When they returned and announced a guilty verdict on every single count, I was filled with a feeling I hadn't known in months. Complete and absolute satisfaction. A reporter waiting outside the courthouse asked how I felt about the outcome. I feel vindicated, I stated plainly. And I feel that justice has been served to people who believe that the elderly are easy targets. When asked if I had a message for my stepson, I considered my words for a moment. Actions have consequences, I declared. Today, Mark learned what those consequences look like. That evening, Michael and I celebrated at the city's finest restaurant. His family had flown in from Toronto for the trial, and my grandchildren were staying with friends while we dealt with the legal aftermath. Victoria asked me, "What now? What's the next step for you?" "Now," I said, raising my wine glass, "I live. I will travel somewhere warm. I will lavish my grandchildren with affection when they visit. And I will savor every day that Mark and Jessica were unable to steal from me." Michael then asked if I had any regrets. "Only one," I replied. "I regret that I spent 27 years trying to love a person who was planning to kill me for money. But that is behind me now." I smiled. The future begins tomorrow. 3 months later, I was back in a courtroom, dressed in my finest suit and wearing my most content expression. I watched as Mark was sentenced to 15 years for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted theft. Jessica received a 12-year sentence. Dr. Evans, who turned out to be a real physician who had been supplementing his income with questionable medical evaluations, had his license revoked and was sentenced to 5 years. The judge asked if I had anything to say to the court. I rose slowly, not because I was frail. The drugs had been completely out of my system for weeks, but because I wanted to savor every second of the moment. Your Honor, I began, I raised Mark Sterling for 27 years. I provided him with food, clothing, and education, and loved him as if he were my own son. I gave him every opportunity to become a decent person. I looked directly at Mark, who was staring at his shoes as if they contained the universe's most profound secrets. Instead, I continued, he repaid that love by trying to systematically poison me into legal incompetence so he could steal everything I had worked for. When he was caught, he showed no remorse, only anger that his scheme had failed. I paused, allowing my words to sink into the packed courtroom. This case had, after all, become a local sensation. The story of an elderly woman outsmarting her stepson's drugging plot was the kind of thing that truly captured people's imagination. I want the court to understand that I feel no pity for him. I feel no family loyalty toward a person who was willing to destroy my mind and my freedom for financial gain. And I hope his sentence serves as a cautionary tale to anyone else who believes that older people are simple targets. The judge nodded in approval. Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. Your courage in documenting this abuse has ensured that these defendants can never victimize anyone else. Courage. I preferred to think of it as being too stubborn to die quietly, but courage worked too. After the sentencing, Michael and I went to my favorite restaurant, the same place where Arthur and I used to celebrate our business victories when we were building the company from the ground up. How does it feel? Michael asked. Like justice, I replied simply. Although I must confess, there is something profoundly satisfying about watching people who thought they were so clever discover that they were not nearly as smart as they believed. What happens now? How I live. I help you manage the company. I travel somewhere warm. And I will never ever take family loyalty for granted again. I raised my wine glass. Mark will now experience exactly what he tried to do to me. He will lose control of his entire life. The only difference is that he truly deserves it. That evening I sat in my living room, my genuine living room, finally free of people who wanted to cause me harm. I called Victoria, Michael's wife. Eleanor, how are you doing? She asked. I'm perfect, dear. Absolutely perfect. Good, she said, because family protects family. Yes, I agreed, looking around my home that was finally, completely mine again. Real family does. Outside my window, the evening was settling into night, peaceful and quiet. Inside my house I was finally completely safe. Mark had tried to steal my mind, my freedom, and my fortune. Instead he had given me something invaluable. The knowledge that I was strong enough, smart enough, and stubborn enough to save myself. And truthfully, that was worth more than any inheritance he had ever dreamed of.